The fortress world of Kairos Prime burned beneath twin suns, its adamantium spires cracked and bleeding molten metal into the ash-choked valleys below. Here, in the crucible of eternal war, 3 armies clashed with the fury of dying gods. Imperial Guard regiments held the eastern ramparts with desperate valour, while Space Marine Terminators carved bloody corridors through the orc hordes that poured from the shattered western gates. Above them all, circling like a carrying bird made of shadow and starlight, something else watched, something that had travelled between the void dark spaces between stars, drawn by the scent of warriors' blood and the promise of skulls worthy of its collection. The creature called itself in the clicking consonants of its race, though it bore no allegiance to the Imperium's Gothic tongue or any human understanding of honour. It was Yaowa, a hunter from beyond the galaxy's edge, and it had come seeking prey that would elevate its standing among the elder council of its clan. In its biomasks targeting matrix, heat signatures bloomed like flowers of violence. Astarte ceramite registered as cold azure outlines, while orc flesh pulsed with savage crimson vitality. The Imperial Guard showed as flickering amber sparks, brief lives burning bright before extinguishing forever. Sergeant Calvis of the 47th Mordian pressed his back against the ruined wall of what had once been a shrine to the God Emperor, his lasgun's charge pack clicking to half capacity. The distinctive whine of orc slugger fire echoed through the rubble-strewn courtyard beyond, punctuated by the thunder of Space Marine bolt rounds finding their mark. He had survived 18 years in His Majesty's service, but something felt wrong about this battlefield. Wrong in ways that made his veteran instincts scream warnings his conscious mind could not yet decode. "Contact 30M West," whispered Private Jorik through the vox bead, his voice tight with the particular fear that came from seeing something that defied understanding. "Something's moving in the smoke, Sarge. Can't get a clean reading on the OPEX. Frag me. It's like it's not even there." 300 meters above, Yithkara adjusted the phase modulation on its cloaking field, the alien technology bending light and electromagnetic radiation around its muscled frame with the precision of a prayer whispered to dark gods. The Hunt Mask's targeting system catalogued 17 different weapon signatures within its immediate vicinity. Las guns, stub guns, a single melter charge cooling from recent discharge. None posed significant threat to its biomesh armour woven from the silk of creatures that fed on solar radiation and forged in the heart of a neutron star's death scream. The first kill came like a whisper. Private Jorik turned toward a sound that might have been wind through the broken stonework, his finger tightening on the trigger of his standard-issue lasgun. The ruby beam lanced through empty air, striking nothing but the memory of heat shimmer. Then the razor-edged wristblade punched through his flak armour between the shoulder blades, parting flesh and bone with surgical precision. The young guardsman had time for one choked gasp before neural toxins flooded his system, paralysing his vocal cords and rendering him insensible to all but the sensation of being lifted from the ground by something impossibly strong. Calvis heard the wet sound of metal parting meat, followed by silence where Jorik's breathing should have been. The sergeant's augmentatic left eye, a souvenir from the siege of Grenel's wake, cycled through infrared and thermal spectrums, but detected only cooling blood and the fading warmth of a corpse suspended 2 meters above the courtyard floor. When he looked again with unaugmented vision, he saw nothing but empty air and the slow drip of crimson droplets falling from an invisible source. "Emperor's blood," he whispered, and keyed his microbead to the company command frequency. "This is Sergeant Calvis, 3rd Platoon. We have contact with unknown hostiles. Repeat, unknown hostiles with advanced stealth capabilities, requesting immediate support and commissarial oversight." The response crackled with static and the distant roar of orbital bombardment. "3rd Platoon, this is command. All available assets committed to primary objectives. Hold position and await extraction. The Emperor protects." Yithkara dragged its first trophy into the shadows of a collapsed buttress, mandibles clicking with satisfaction as it examined the quality of the kill. The human had died cleanly without cowardice or surrender, and the skull would sit well among the others in its ship's trophy room. With practiced efficiency born of countless hunts across a dozen worlds, the predator began the ritual skinning, its blade work precise enough to preserve both cranium and spinal column in a single elegant curve. The scream that echoed from the courtyard brought 3 more guardsmen running, their boots crunching on broken ceramite and the powdered remains of stained glass windows. They found Yorish's body hanging upside down from a twisted support beam, flayed with surgical precision and emptied of all but the architecture of bone. His skull was gone along with a considerable portion of his spinal column, leaving only the hollow shell of meat that had once housed a human soul. "Heretics," snarled Corporal Vex, his scarred face twisting with the particular hatred that Morians reserved for those who desecrated the Emperor's soldiers. "Has to be Dark Eldar. Those sick bastards love their trophies." But Guardsman Thorn, barely 18 and still carrying the soft look of a Hive City youth, shook his head slowly. His pale eyes stared at the precise cuts, the surgical removal of specific anatomical structures, the complete absence of the cruel artistry that marked Ukari handiwork. "No, sir, this is something else, something that hunts." The plasma bolt that vaporized Corporal Vex's head came from empty air, a lance of stellar fire that reduced 40 years of military experience to superheated vapor in the space between heartbeats. Thorn dove for cover behind a fallen statue of St. Macarius as 2 more shots seared through the space where he had been standing, each one precise enough to have taken him cleanly if he had not possessed the reflexes of youth and terror. Yithra decloaked in a shimmer of distorted light, its 7F frame materializing like a fever dream given form. Biomechanical armor covered its torso and limbs, seamlessly integrated with the alien physiology that had evolved on worlds where only the perfect predator could survive to breed. Twin mandibles flanked a mouth filled with teeth like ivory daggers, while eyes the color of molten copper tracked the remaining humans with the focused intensity of a born killer. The Predator's shoulder-mounted plasma cannons swiveled with mechanical precision, seeking the guardsmen who had gone to ground behind the Saints' Marble remains. But Thorn had not survived 3 years in the Imperial Guard by standing still when death came calling. He rolled left as the plasma bolt reduced St. Macarius's stern face to glowing slag, came up, firing his lasgun on full auto, and sprinted for the relative safety of the shrine's broken doorway. Loose beams scattered across Yithkara's biomesh armor like rain against a mountainside, the focused light dissipating harmlessly against energy fields that had turned aside the claws of creatures born in the hearts of gas giants. But the human's evasive tactics impressed the hunter. This one possessed the killer instinct, the willingness to move and adapt rather than freeze in the face of superior predation. It would make a worthy addition to the collection. Thorn's boots hammered against broken stone as he bounded through the shrine's shattered interior, seeking cover among the fallen prayer pods and broken altar screens. Behind him, the distinctive sound of alien footsteps closed the distance with inexorable patience. The creature was not rushing, not allowing bloodlust to cloud its judgment. It was hunting, and hunters understood the value of patience. The young guardsman pressed his back against a massive stone column, its surface carved with scenes of the Emperor's great victories during the Unification Wars. His lasgun's power cell showed 3/4 charge, enough for perhaps 24 shots if he made each one count. The microbead in his ear crackled with static, and the distant sound of human voices calling for support that would not come in time. A shadow passed across the coloured light streaming through the shrine's broken dome, then another. The Predator was circling, using the vertical space to its advantage, seeking the optimal angle for a killing strike. Thorn closed his eyes and tried to remember the lessons drilled into him during basic training on Morian Prime. Know your enemy, know your environment, know yourself. The enemy was invisible, heavily armed, and possessed of reflexes that made Space Marines look sluggish. The environment was a ruined shrine with limited cover and multiple entry points. Himself, he was one frightened guardsman with a lasgun, and perhaps 3 minutes before his position became untenable. But he was also Mordian Iron Guard, heir to a tradition of discipline and tactical acumen that stretched back 10,000 years, and Mordians did not yield. The targeting laser that painted his position came from above and to the left, a thin red line that spoke of incoming plasma fire hot enough to melt ceramite. Thorn threw himself sideways as the column exploded into superheated fragments, rolled to his feet behind the twisted remains of a bronze lect and squeezed off a 3-round burst at the shimmer of displaced air he glimpsed between the falling debris. One shot connected. The last beam struck something solid and rewarded him with a sound like breaking glass as exotic energy fields overloaded and collapsed. Ikara's cloaking device failed in a cascade of sparkling distortions, revealing the hunter in all its terrible glory as it dropped from the shrine's vaulted ceiling with feline grace. The creature landed in a crouch that spoke of perfect balance and predatory patience. Biomask scanning the ruined interior for signs of its quarry. Heat bloom patterns painted the walls in false colour, while electromagnetic sensors probed for the distinctive signature of human technology. But the young guardsman had learned the first lesson of survival warfare. When facing a superior opponent, change the rules of engagement. Thorn had used the moments of confusion to slip through a gap in the shrine's eastern wall, emerging into the courtyard where his squad's bodies lay in spreading pools of crimson. His hands moved with practice efficiency as he stripped Corporal Vex's corpse of grenades and ammunition, loading his belt with every frag and crack charge the dead man had carried. If he was going to die, he would make it expensive. The sound of shifting masonry announced the predator's emergence from the shrine, Biomask swiving as it tracked the lingering heat signature of human passage. Ithkara's mandibles spread in what might have been approval. This prey was thinking tactically, using resources and terrain rather than relying on simple flight responses. The skull would indeed be worthy of honour. But the hunter had not anticipated the lengths to which Imperial Guard veterans would go to deny their enemies victory. As Yithkara stepped into the courtyard, Thorn triggered the improvised minefield he had constructed from his dead comrades' explosives, turning 20 meters of broken stone into a killing field of shrapnel and concussive force. The blast waves slammed the predator backward into the shrine's wall, biomesh armor sparking as overloaded systems struggled to compensate for damage that exceeded design parameters. Warning runes flashed across the Huntmask's display, while diagnostics reported stress fractures in the shoulder-mounted plasma cannon and a 17% decrease in cloaking field efficiency. For the first time since Planetfall, felt something approaching surprise. The human had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon, using the corpses of its packmates as components in a trap that spoke of tactical sophistication beyond what the hunter had expected from such apparently simple prey. Perhaps this species was more worthy of study than initial reconnaissance had suggested. Thorn emerged from cover with smoke still rising from his singed flak armour. Laz gun trained on the creature's centre of mass. At this range, even Imperial Guard's standard issue could punch through energy shielding weakened by explosive decompression. His finger tightened on the trigger as he prepared to end the nightmare that had already cost him 3 squadmates. The wristblade that erupted from his chest came without warning, punching through armour and flesh with the whispered efficiency of perfect ambush technique. Yithkara had used the explosion's cover to activate emergency cloaking protocols, circling behind its target, while the human's attention remained fixed on empty air. The young guardsman had time to look down at the gleaming metal protruding from his sternum before neural toxins flooded his system and consciousness fled like water from a broken dam. As Thorn collapsed, Carrara stood over the fallen warrior and felt the peculiar satisfaction that came from a hunt. Well concluded, this human had adapted, improvised, and nearly succeeded in turning superior technology against itself. The skull would occupy a place of honour in the trophy room, a reminder that even the smallest prey could teach lessons worth learning. But the hunter's satisfaction was short-lived. The distinctive whine of teleportation energies filled the courtyard as reality itself seemed to fold inward, like a flower closing its petals. Space Marines materialized in the crackling aftermath of Void Shield displacement, their midnight blue armor marked with the silver skulls and bone-white trim of the Death Spectre's chapter. Terminators, the elite of the elite, armed with storm bolters and power weapons that could cleave through tank armor. Brother Sergeant Malachar stepped forward, his ancient suit of tactical dreadnought armor humming with the barely contained fury of machine spirits that had witnessed 10,000 years of warfare. Behind his tusked helm, targeting systems catalogued the carnage with mechanical precision, while his enhanced estate senses past scent molecules that spoke of alien pheromones and exotic weapon discharges. Xenos, he said, the word carrying all the contempt that 8 centuries of service could distill into a single syllable. You have trespassed upon Imperial soil and murdered soldiers of the Emperor. For this transgression, you will die. IF's biomask cycled through threat assessment protocols as it analysed these new arrivals. The armour was primitive by its species standards, but massively overbuilt. Layers of ceramite and adamantium thick enough to turn aside all but the most focused energy discharges. The warriors inside registered as significantly larger and more robust than baseline humans, with biosigns that suggested genetic modification on a scale that approached what the Yusha themselves had achieved through millennia of selective breeding. These were apex predators in their own right. The hunt had just become exponentially more dangerous. Brother Thaddeus raised his stormbolter, the weapon's twin barrels tracking the alien's centre of mass with the precision of a prayer made manifest. "Brother Sergeant, shall I engage?" "Negative," Malachar replied, studying the creature with the cold calculation of a warrior who had faced every horror the galaxy could spawn. "This Xenos possesses technology beyond standard classifications. Command has ordered live capture for Mechanicus analysis." The Predator's mandibles spread in what might have been amusement. These armoured giants spoke as though capture was already assured, as though superior numbers and heavier weapons guaranteed victory. They had clearly never hunted creatures that had perfected the art of killing before their species had learned to shape metal into blades. Ithkar triggered its shoulder-mounted plasma cannon, sending a bolt of stellar fire directly into Brother Thaddeus's centre of mass. The shot struck the Terminator's storm shield and dispersed in a shower of energetic particles, the ancient relic's conversion field, turning superheated plasma into harmless light and heat. But the impact staggered the Space Marine, servo motors in his armour whining as they compensated for the massive transfer of kinetic energy. "Throne of Earth," breathed Brother Cassius, raising his power fist as energy fields crackled around its adamantium knuckles. That was a direct hit. "How is Thaddeus still standing?" "Storm shield held," Thaddeus reported, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a veteran who had just survived something that should have killed him. "Field integrity at 70%. I can take perhaps 3 more shots of that magnitude." Brother Sergeant Malachar activated his power sword, the ancient blade humming to life with the controlled fury of a caged lightning bolt. "Close formation. Advance by fire and movement. Remember, the Magos wants this creature intact. Disable, don't destroy." The Terminators began their advance with the inexorable patience of an avalanche. Storm bolters chattering as they laid down, suppressing fire while moving from cover to cover. Mass-reactive bolts detonated against the shrine's broken walls in showers of stone and metal, each explosion designed to funnel the alien toward the waiting power weapons of their brothers. But Yithkara had not survived 3 decades of hunting across hostile worlds by fighting on ground chosen by the enemy. The creature bounded up the shrine's exterior wall with liquid grace. Biomesh armors integrated anti-grav systems, negating the effects of gravity, while magnetic grips found purchase on even the smoothest surfaces. From this elevated position, the hunter could rain death down upon its pursuers while denying them clean lines of fire. A second plasma bolt lanced down into the courtyard, striking Brother Cases in the shoulder and spinning the massive Terminator halfway around. His storm shield absorbed most of the energy, but feedback from the overloaded conversion field sent warning runes cascading across his helmet display. The ancient armor system strained to compensate for thermal stress that pushed even blessed ceramite beyond its design limits. "Target is mobile," Malachar reported over the tactical frequency. "Standard suppression tactics ineffective, requesting orbital support." The response came crackling through the Vox with the hollow authority of a ship's captain who had seen too many worlds burn. Negative Death Spectre's orbital bombardment would compromise primary objectives. You will adapt and overcome using available resources. Ithara triggered its cloaking field, vanishing from visual and thermal spectrums as it repositioned along the shrine's upper reaches. The damaged stealth system flickered and sparked, but held long enough to break the Space Marine's target lock and force them into reactive positions. From the shadows of a gargoyle stone embrace, the hunter studied its prey with the focused intensity of a natural philosopher dissecting a particularly interesting specimen. These armoured giants possessed strength and durability that rivaled the greatest warriors of the Yao clans, but they thought like pack hunters rather than solitary predators. They coordinated their movements, covered each other's flanks, and attempted to control the battlefield through superior firepower rather than superior positioning. It was a tactical doctrine that had clearly served them well against other enemies, but it could be turned against them by a sufficiently patient opponent. The hunter dropped from its perch like a falling star, landing behind Brother Cassius as the Terminator swept his stormbolter across empty air. Yithkara's wrist blade punched through the gap between helmet and gore, seeking the soft flesh beneath layers of ceramite and adamantium. But Astarte's reflexes were faster than human thought, and Cassius twisted away from the killing strike with a speed that should have been impossible for something wearing 2 tons of powered armor. The blade skittered across ceramite plating, scoring deep gouges but failing to penetrate. Cassius spun with his power fist extended, the weapon's energy field crackling as it sought alien flesh. Yithkara leaped backward, anti-grav systems howling as they fought to overcome the Space Marine's incredible reach and the raw, destructive power of the Thunderhammer that Brother Thaddeus brought whistling through the space where the hunter's torso had been a microsecond before. The Predator landed in a crouch biomask, cycling through tactical assessments as it recalculated the threat level these warriors represented. Their reaction times approached those of seasoned Yucha hunters, while their coordination spoke of battlefield experience measured in centuries rather than decades. This would require a different approach, one that acknowledged the reality of facing opponents who were themselves apex predators. Brother Sergeant Malachar activated his helmet's Voxcaster, filling the courtyard with the deep bass tones of Astartes' authority. Alien creature, you're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and you will be granted the mercy of a clean death after interrogation. The hunter's mandibles spread in what any student of Xenos Physioamy would have recognized as predatory amusement. These giants believed that superior numbers and heavier weapons guaranteed victory, just as countless other species had believed before they became trophies in the halls of the Huntmasters. But the galaxy was vast and full of creatures that had learned the fundamental truth of existence. The perfect predator needed neither pack nor pride, only patience and the willingness to kill. Yithkara triggered the self-destruct sequence built into its shoulder-mounted plasma cannon. The weapon's containment field collapsed in a controlled cascade, releasing stored energy in a directed blast that turned the shrine's courtyard into a crater of molten stone and twisted metal. The explosion drove the Terminators to their knees, their armor's auto-senses cycling through emergency protocols as blast waves and thermal radiation threatened to overwhelm even their enhanced protection systems. When the smoke cleared, the alien was gone. Only a patch of slightly disturbed ash marked where it had been standing, along with the acrid scent of ozone and exotic particle decay that spoke of technology beyond imperial understanding. "Report," Malachar commanded, rising from the smoking ruin with servo motors whining in protest. "Minor system damage across all units," replied Brother Thaddeus, running diagnostics on armor that had absorbed punishment that would have vaporized lesser warriors. The Xeno sacrificed its primary weapon to break contact. Clever. But Brother Cassius was studying the blast pattern with the focused intensity of a warrior who had seen too many battlefields to accept simple answers. "Brother Sergeant, this was not a desperate gambit. The creature planned this from the moment it engaged us. It used our own tactical doctrine against us." Before Malachar could respond, the distinctive bellow of orc war cries echoed across the broken cityscape. A mob of greenkins poured through the gaps in the eastern wall, their crude weapons chattering as they spotted the Space Marines standing in the smoking crater. But these were not the usual rabble of boys and Gretchen. These wore the black and white war paint of the Death Skull clan, and their crude bionics sparked with the particular energy that came from technology, looted from 100 different battlefields. Zoggen L roared the knob leading the charge, his power claw crackling with badly regulated energy fields. Space Marines, and they've been fighting something else. This is going to be proper good. The tactical situation had just become exponentially more complex. Ikara watched from the shadows of a collapsed spire biomask, analysing the new arrivals with the cold precision of a natural philosopher studying an interesting chemical reaction. These creatures registered as crude but enthusiastic warriors, their weapons primitive but numerous. More importantly, they showed no signs of the coordination or tactical discipline that had made the armoured giants such challenging opponents. The orcs hit the Space Marines like a green tide of crude metal and barely contained violence. Slugger rounds spanged off ceramite armour while crude choppers sought gaps in the Terminator's protection, with the random enthusiasm of natural selection made manifest. The Death Spectres responded with the disciplined fury of warriors who had perfected the art of killing over 8 centuries of continuous warfare. Brother Thaddeus's Stormbolter chattered in controlled bursts, each bolt finding its mark with the precision of a prayer answered by the Emperor himself. Orc bodies erupted in showers of gore and bone fragments as mass reactive rounds detonated inside their target's torso cavity. But for every green skin that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place, their crude weapons hammering against storm shields that sparked and overloaded under sustained fire. Ithkara recognized opportunity when it presented itself. While the 2 groups of warriors focused on each other, The hunter could observe their tactics, study their capabilities, and plan accordingly. The armored giants possessed superior weapons and protection, but the green-skinned creatures made up for technological deficiency with raw numbers and suicidal enthusiasm. Both groups would exhaust themselves in mutual slaughter, leaving their best warriors wounded and their ammunition depleted. The predator began to move through the battlefield's periphery, using the smoke and chaos of combat to mask its approach. Its biomask tracked individual warriors on both sides, cataloguing their weapons and capabilities, while noting which ones showed signs of leadership or exceptional skill. Those would be the prizes worth taking, the skulls that would elevate its standing among the huntmasters of its clan. Brother Sergeant Malakar's power sword carved through orc flesh like lightning given form, each stroke precisely calculated to maximize damage while conserving energy for the extended engagement ahead. His tactical display showed ammunition levels dropping toward critical thresholds, while armor integrity warnings flashed amber across multiple systems. The greenskins were crude but numerous, and even Terminator armor had limits. Brother Cassius, ammunition status, 40% remaining, Brother Sergeant. These Xenos are more numerous than initial reconnaissance suggested. A crude rocket struck Brother Thaddeus in the chest, the warhead's primitive guidance system somehow managing to penetrate his storm shield's energy field before detonating against ceramite plating. The explosion staggered the massive Terminator backward, servo motors screaming as they struggled to compensate for the massive kinetic transfer. Warning runes cascaded across his helmet display as systems that had functioned flawlessly for 3 centuries suddenly reported critical errors. The orc knob responsible for the hit raised his crude launcher with a bellow of savage joy. Got one of Dartin boys, who's next for some of Scarfang's special treatment. But Scarfang had made the fundamental error of celebrating victory before achieving it. Brother Thaddeus straightened from his combat crouch, armor systems cycling through emergency repairs, as machine spirits that had tasted the fury of 1,000 battlefields responded to his prayer for continued function. His thundermer rose with the inexorable patience of divine judgment, energy fields crackling around the weapon's adamantium head. The blow that ended Scarfang's existence registered on seismic detectors 3 kilometers away. The orc knob simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. His atoms scattered across a 20-meter radius as the Thunderhammer's disruptor field unmade the fundamental bonds holding matter together. The greenkins closest to the detonation staggered backward, their crude augmentics sparking as electromagnetic pulse effects, overloaded anything more sophisticated than a pointed stick. Ikara watched this display of destructive power with the appreciation of a connoisseur studying a particularly elegant work of art. The armored giant had just demonstrated weapon technology that bordered on what the Yusha themselves employed, turning an opponent into component atoms with casual efficiency. These warriors were indeed worthy prey, possessed of both skill and equipment that would challenge even the most experienced hunter. The alien began its final approach, using the distraction of renewed orc assault to close within striking distance of the Space Marines. Its cloaking field flickered and sparked from accumulated damage, but held long enough to bring the hunter within reach of its chosen target. Brother Cassius stood at the formation's left flank, his power fist crackling as it sought fresh opponents among the charging greenkins. The wristblade that punched through his gore came without warning, sliding between armor plates with surgical precision to sever the arteries feeding his primary heart. Artie's physiology was remarkable in its redundancy, but even Space Marines could not function indefinitely with massive blood loss and critical organ damage. Cassius dropped to one knee, his power fist falling silent as neural pathways struggled to compensate for catastrophic trauma. But dying Space Marines were still Space Marines, and 8 centuries of combat experience could not be dismissed by mere physiological failure. As consciousness began to fade, Cassius triggered his armor's emergency beacon while speaking the words of the final litany into his helmet's Vox recorder. His genetic legacy would survive even if his flesh did not, preserved in the chapter's gene seed banks for future generations of warriors to carry forward. Yithkara materialized over the fallen Terminator, cloaking field collapsing as power systems diverted energy to more critical functions. The hunter's biomask registered the approaching heat signatures of the remaining Space Marines, their weapons cycling to full power as they prepared to avenge their fallen brother. But the trophy was almost within reach, and Yautja honor demanded that no worthy kill be left unclaimed. The hunter's ritual blade began its work with practice efficiency, separating skull from spine with cuts that spoke of countless similar procedures performed across a dozen worlds. Brother Cassius's helmet fell away to reveal features that bore the ritual scarification of a chapter that traced its lineage back to the dark days of the Horus heresy. This skull would indeed occupy a place of honour in the trophy hall. "Xenos filth," snarled Brother Sergeant Malachar, his power sword humming with barely contained fury. "You will pay for that insult to the chapter's honour." The remaining Terminators advanced with the measured pace of judgment incarnate, their storm bolters chattering as they laid down suppressing fire designed to drive the alien into the killing ground their formation created. But Ithkara had claimed its primary prize, and tactical doctrine suggested that withdrawal was preferable to extended engagement against superior numbers. The hunter triggered its emergency teleportation beacon, exotic energies beginning to build around its frame. As the device prepared to extract its user from the battlefield, reality began to fold inward like a flower closing its petals, space-time itself bending to accommodate technology that treated the fundamental laws of physics as merely strong suggestions. But Brother Thaddeus had recognized the distinctive energy signature from encounters with other species that employed similar transportation methods. His thunder hammer described a perfect arc through the air, its disruptor field intersecting the alien's teleportation matrix at the precise moment when dimensional barriers were at their weakest. The resulting explosion registered on orbital monitoring stations as a localized space-time anomaly of unprecedented magnitude. Reality buckled and screamed as two incompatible technologies attempted to occupy the same quantum space, their competing field equations creating a feedback loop that threatened to tear a hole in the fabric of existence itself. When the distortion cleared, both hunter and hunted had vanished. Only a patch of crystallized air marked where they had been standing, along with readings that would puzzle tech adepts for decades to come. The remaining death spectres stood in the sudden silence, their armor's sensors detecting nothing but the background radiation of a universe that had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. "Where did they go?" asked Brother Thaddeus, cycling through every spectrum his helmet could detect. Malachar studied the crystallized air with the cold precision of a warrior who had seen reality bend around the whims of chaos gods and Xeno's technology. "Elsewhere, brother, the question is whether they survived the journey. 3 star systems away on the dead world of Xerion Prime. Something fell from the void like a burning meteor. The impact crater measured 50 meters across and glowed with residual energy that made the planet's long-dead atmosphere shimmer with aurora patterns. At its center, 2 figures lay motionless among the twisted remains of technologies that had never been meant to interact. Ikara stirred first, its biomesh armor sparking as redundant systems came online to compensate for damage that pushed even Yusha engineering to its limits. The hunter's biomask flickered through diagnostic routines, while medical subsystems flooded its bloodstream with stimulants designed to counteract the effects of interdimensional transit trauma. According to the suit's chronometer, 17 hours had passed since the teleportation attempt. Beside the alien, Brother Thaddeus began the slow process of consciousness recovery, his Terminator armor's machine spirits singing hymns of repair as they worked to restore functionality to systems that had been subjected to stresses beyond their design parameters. The Space Marine's enhanced physiology had allowed him to survive energies that would have unmade lesser beings, but survival was not the same as victory. Both warriors rose simultaneously, their movements speaking of predatory instincts that transcended species boundaries. Here on this dead world beneath alien stars, they would settle accounts that had been interrupted by the violent intersection of incompatible technologies. No witnesses, no tactical support, no objective save the fundamental imperative to determine which apex predator would claim the other's skull as trophy. Ithkara's plasma cannon had been destroyed in the dimensional transit along with most of its secondary weapon systems, but the hunter still possessed its ritual blades and the accumulated wisdom of 3 decades spent perfecting the art of killing. Against a single opponent, even one as formidable as the armored giant, such advantages might prove sufficient. Brother Thaddeus assessed his own capabilities with the cold precision of a warrior who had learned to function despite massive system failures. His Stormbolter was offline, its machine spirit apparently offended by being subjected to forces that violated several fundamental laws of physics. But his Thunderhammer remained functional, its energy fields crackling with the barely contained fury of a weapon that had tasted the blood of gods. They began to circle each other with the patient deliberation of natural philosophers, testing competing theories about the nature of existence. Each step was calculated, each movement designed to probe for weaknesses while concealing their own vulnerabilities. This was combat refined to its purest essence, stripped of everything save skill and the willingness to die for victory. The alien struck first, its wristblade seeking the gap between helmet and gorget with surgical precision. But Thaddeus had fought too many close-quarters engagements to be surprised by speed, and his thunderhammer intercepted the attack with timing that approached the mystical. Exotic metals screamed against each other as technologies separated by millions of years of evolution tested their fundamental incompatibility. Yithkara rolled away from the counterattack, its anti-grav systems howling as they fought to overcome momentum that could have shattered mountains. The Space Marine's weapon moved with speed that should have been impossible for something so massive, guided by reflexes that had been honed by centuries of constant warfare. This opponent was indeed worthy of the Huntmaster's personal attention. They came together again in a blur of controlled violence, alien blade meeting thunderhammer in exchanges too fast for unaugmented eyes to follow. Each strike was potentially lethal, each parry performed with precision that left no margin for error. Sparks showered from damaged armor as weapons found their mark, but neither combatant showed signs of yielding to mere physical trauma. Brother Thaddeus fought with the cold fury of a warrior who had sworn oaths that transcended death itself. His chapter had stood vigil over the Imperium for 10,000 years, and he would not be the link that broke that chain of honor. Each swing of his thunderhammer carried the weight of accumulated duty, the accumulated prayers of brothers who had fallen so that humanity might endure another day. But Yithkara fought with something deeper than duty or honor. The hunt was the essence of its being, the fundamental imperative that had driven its species to master technologies that could reshape reality itself. To fail here on this dead world beneath alien stars would be to betray not just personal pride, but the evolutionary destiny that had carried the Yusha from their homeworld to the darkest corners of the galaxy. The duel raged across Zerion Prime's lifeless surface, two apex predators testing the limits of flesh and technology against the unforgiving mathematics of violent death. The Space Marine's thunderhammer cracked the planet's bedrock while the aliens' ritual blades carved furrows in stone that had not felt the touch of weather for 10,000 years. Neither gave ground, neither asked for quarter. It was Thaddeus who made the first critical error. His thunderhammer's energy field fluctuating as damaged power conduits struggled to maintain coherent disruptor matrices. The weapon swing fell short by perhaps a centimetre, creating an opening that lasted for perhaps 1/10 of a second. For a hunter like Yithkara, 1/10 of a second was eternity. The wristblade punched through the gap between breastplate and pauldron, sliding between ceramite layers to find the soft flesh beneath. Even Art's physiology had limits, and the alien toxins flooding into his bloodstream were designed to bring down creatures that made Space Marines look frail. Brother Thaddeus fell to one knee, his thunderhammer falling silent as neural pathways shut down in response to poisons that attacked the very foundations of life itself. But death was an old companion to warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, and he faced it with the same calm acceptance that had carried him through 3 centuries of endless war. "The Emperor protects," he whispered, the words carrying across the dead world's silence with the weight of absolute faith. Ikara stood over the fallen warrior, mandibles clicking with satisfaction as it contemplated the trophy that would crown its collection. This armoured giant had fought with skill that rivaled the greatest champions of the Yao clans, pushing the hunter to limits it had not tested since earning its first mark of adulthood. The skull would occupy the place of highest honour in its ship's trophy room. But as the hunter began the ritual that would separate skull from spine, something stirred in the crater's depths. The dimensional distortion that had brought them to this place had left echoes in the quantum foam, ripples in space-time that were only now beginning to propagate outward from their point of origin. Reality itself was wounded, bleeding possibilities that should never have existed. The first sign was the temperature drop. Zerion Prime's already frigid atmosphere began to crystallize, oxygen molecules freezing solid before falling like snow to the planet's surface. Then came the lights, aurora patterns that danced across the sky in colours that had no names in any terrestrial language. Finally, the sound, a deep bass note that seemed to emerge from the planet's core itself. Something was coming through the dimensional breach, something vast and hungry and utterly alien to both the Imperium's understanding of reality and the Yusha's accumulated knowledge of the galaxy's hidden corners. The space between moments began to thin, allowing creatures that existed in the spaces between thoughts to pour through into real space like water through a shattered dam. Ithkara felt the familiar chill that came from encountering prey that was also predator, something that existed at the apex of evolutionary chains that had never included its own species. The biomass sensors detected movement in spectrums that should not have existed, while threat assessment protocols cycled through warnings that made no sense to minds evolved in conventional reality. Brother Thaddeus stirred a stark physiology, fighting against toxins that had been designed for creatures with radically different biochemistry. His enhanced metabolism began breaking down the alien compounds, neutralizing them through sheer biological stubbornness and the inherited resistance of a gene line that had survived 10,000 years of constant warfare. Death would claim him eventually, but not yet. Not while duty remained unfulfilled. "Xenos," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crystallizing air. "We have made a mistake. Our conflict has torn reality itself." The hunter looked up from its ritual preparations, biomask cycling through analysis modes as it tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was emerging from the dimensional breach. Creatures that existed partially in real space and partially in dimensions that curved back upon themselves were beginning to manifest, their forms shifting and changing as they adapted to the alien physics of conventional reality. These were not opponents to be hunted with ritual blades and plasma weapons. These were forces of nature given malevolent consciousness, entities that fed on the fundamental forces that held matter together. Against such beings, the ancient enmity between Space Marine and Predator seemed suddenly insignificant. Thaddeus forced himself upright, servo motors in his armor whining as they fought to compensate for systems damaged by interdimensional transit and alien toxins. His thunderhammer flickered to life, its energy field sputtering, but functional. If he was going to die on this forgotten world, he would die as befitted a warrior of the Death Spectres, standing against the enemies of mankind with weapon in hand and prayers on his lips. Ikara made a decision that would have horrified the elders of its clan. It extended one clawed hand toward the Space Marine, offering assistance to a being it had been trying to kill moments before. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning, transcending the barriers of species and language through the universal grammar of warriors recognizing shared threat. "Alliance," the hunter said, the word emerging from its biomask's translation protocols in heavily accented Gothic until the breach is sealed. Thaddeus considered the offer for perhaps 3 seconds, weighing duty against pragmatism while reality continued to bleed impossible geometries into conventional space-time. Then he clasped the alien's forearm with his free hand, ceramite gauntlet meeting biomesh armor in a grip that spoke of mutual respect and shared necessity. "Agreed," he said. "The Emperor may forgive me. The galaxy will not survive what comes through that breach." The creatures emerging from the dimensional wound defied description in any language evolved by minds that existed in 3-dimensional space. They were angles that folded back upon themselves, colours that existed in spectrums beyond perception, sounds that could be seen and light that could be heard. Worst of all, they were hungry, driven by appetites that included concepts like causality and linear time among their preferred sustenance. One of the entities flowed toward the unlikely allies with the deliberate patience of a tide that knew all shores must eventually yield. It existed simultaneously as crystalline geometries and organic corruption, its form shifting through states of matter that included several that had never been catalogued by Imperial science. Where it touched the planet's surface, rock began to age at accelerated rates, crumbling to dust as eons passed in microseconds. Brother Thaddeus opened fire with his storm bolter, mass-reactive rounds detonating harmlessly against something that existed in too many dimensions to be damaged by conventional weapons. The creature flowed around the gunfire like water around stones, its form adapting to treat solid matter as merely another spectrum of reality, to be navigated rather than obeyed. If its remaining weapons proved equally ineffective, plasma bolts passed through the entity without apparent effect, while wrist blades found no purchase on flesh that existed partially in dimensions where cutting had no meaning. The hunter's biomask cycled through every analytical mode in its database, but found no reference for something that treated fundamental physics as optional guidelines. "Conventional weapons are useless," Thaddeus observed. his tactical systems reaching the same conclusion through different analytical frameworks. We need to collapse the breach itself. Without a dimensional anchor, these entities should be drawn back to wherever they originated. The alien's mandibles clicked with what might have been agreement, or might have been frustration. Its biomask's translation protocols struggled with concepts that existed at the intersection of theoretical physics and practical xenobiology. But the underlying logic was sound. Cut off the source, and the symptoms would resolve themselves. But the breach was expanding. Reality wounds spreading like cracks in glass as more entities forced their way through into conventional space-time. What had begun as a localized distortion now stretched across several kilometers of Xerion Prime's surface, bleeding energies that made the planet's dead atmosphere writhe with patterns that hurt to perceive. Another entity manifested near the crater's edge, this one resembling a collection of mathematical equations that had somehow achieved malevolent consciousness. It began to deconstruct the surrounding matter at the subatomic level, reducing complex molecular structures to their component particles through processes that treated chemistry as merely elaborate poetry. Thaddeus felt his armor's machine spirits screaming warnings as the entity's influence began affecting their blessed coitators. Systems that had functioned flawlessly for centuries suddenly reported errors that made no sense, calculating results that violated basic mathematical principles while somehow remaining internally consistent. Even sacred technology had limits when faced with beings that could rewrite the fundamental constants of reality. "We need to reach the breach's center," he said, gesturing toward the dimensional wound's heart with his thunder hammer. "Destabilize the quantum matrix holding it open." If Biomask highlighted a path through the chaos, tracking stable ground that might support their combined weight, while avoiding the worst concentrations of dimensional distortion. But reaching the breach's center would require crossing nearly a kilometer of terrain that had been transformed into something that existed in too many dimensions to be safely navigated by minds evolved for three-dimensional existence. The unlikely allies began their advance with the careful deliberation of soldiers crossing a minefield, each step calculated to minimize their exposure to entities that treated linear time as merely another direction in which to move. Behind them, more creatures emerged from the breach, their forms growing more complex and malevolent as the dimensional wound widened. The journey became a nightmare of careful movement punctuated by moments of absolute terror as entities flowed past them like living nightmares given geometric form. Several times they were forced to take shelter behind formations of crystallized space-time, waiting for particularly dangerous predators to drift past on currents that existed perpendicular to conventional reality. Halfway to their destination, they encountered something that made even the reality-bending entities seem comprehensible. It was absence given form, a collection of missing concepts that existed by virtue of not existing. Where it passed, it left behind voids in causality itself, gaps in the chain of cause and effect that made objects spontaneously cease to be without ever having been destroyed. "Can your weapons affect that?" Thaddeus asked, studying the entity with senses that reported conflicting data about something that was simultaneously present and absent. If Kara's biomask attempted analysis and promptly shut down several of its primary systems to prevent cascade failures, unknown. Conventional parameters do not apply. We must attempt bypass. They skirted the entity's area of influence with painful care, stepping between gaps in existence while trying not to contemplate the philosophical implications of encountering something that proved the universe was far stranger and more fragile than either of their species had imagined. Behind them, more reality wounds began opening as the original breach's expansion destabilized local space-time on a planetary scale. The breach's center was a maelstrom of impossible geometries, angles that folded back upon themselves in ways that made geometry itself seem like a weak approximation of underlying truths. Here, at the heart of the dimensional wound, the barriers between realities had worn thin enough that contradictory physics could coexist without destroying each other. Brother Thaddeus studied the swirling energies with sensors that struggled to process input from spectrums that should not have existed. His armor's machine spirits had given up trying to catalogue the phenomena, defaulting to prayer cycles and incense burnings in the hope that sacred ritual might succeed where logic had failed. "The quantum matrix is anchored by recursive temporal loops," he said, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that came from contemplating problems that existed at the intersection of theology and theoretical physics. We need to introduce a paradox significant enough to collapse the entire structure. Heathcara's biomask had reached similar conclusions through entirely different analytical pathways. The breach existed because two incompatible technologies had attempted to occupy the same dimensional space, creating a feedback loop that threatened to expand until it consumed the entire stellar region. But feedback loops could be disrupted if the right kind of interference was introduced at precisely the right moment. The hammer, the hunter said, gesturing toward Thaddeus's thunderhammer with obvious reluctance. Its disruptor field operates on similar principles to the breach matrix. If properly calibrated, the Space Marine understood immediately his weapon's energy field could be reconfigured to match the breach's quantum frequency, creating interference patterns that would force the dimensional wound to collapse in upon itself. But such a recalibration would destroy the thunderhammer, along with whoever was foolish enough to trigger the process manually. "I will do it," Thaddeus said, beginning the modification rituals that would turn his sacred weapon into a one-shot reality stabilizer. The Death Spectres have stood vigil for 10,000 years, one more sacrifice in the Emperor's name. But Ether's mandibles spread in what any student of alien psychology would have recognized as determination mixed with something approaching respect. The hunter had claimed this warrior's skull through combat, which made the trophy its responsibility according to traditions that stretched back to the dawn of Yao civilization. Honor demanded that no prey be allowed to die except by the hunter's choice. Negative, the alien said, its translation protocols struggling with concepts that existed at the intersection of predatory instinct and warrior philosophy. The kill is mine to claim. The honor is mine to bear. They stood at the center of a dimensional maelstrom, two apex predators from species that had never been meant to meet, arguing over who possessed the right to sacrifice themselves for the salvation of a galaxy that cared nothing for their individual existence. Around them, reality continued to bleed impossible geometries, while entities that fed on the fundamental forces of existence gathered for a feast that would make the heat death of the universe seem like a minor inconvenience. In the end, it was Brother Thaddeus who resolved the impasse with characteristic arts pragmatism. He handed the reconfigured thunderhammer to Ithkara, then clasped the alien's shoulder with his ceramite gauntlet in a gesture that transcended species boundaries through the universal language of warriors facing death with dignity. Together, he said, "The Emperor protects. May your gods do the same." Ithkara accepted the weapon with the reverence due to a sacred relic, its biomesh armor's targeting systems interfacing with the thunderhammer's machine spirit through protocols that should not have been compatible, but somehow achieved harmony through shared purpose. The hunter's mandibles clicked once in what might have been prayer, or might have been the final breath before diving into unknown depths. They triggered the device together, their hands meeting on the activation stud as the reconfigured disruptor field began generating interference patterns that made reality itself scream in harmonics that could shatter minds. The quantum matrix holding the breach open began to destabilize, its recursive temporal loops collapsing as paradox cascaded through dimensional barriers that had never been meant to contain forces of this magnitude. The explosion that followed registered on monitoring stations throughout the sector as a localized space-time anomaly of unprecedented scale. Xerion Prime simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, but edited out of reality's manuscript as causality itself, rewrote local history to accommodate the fundamental impossibility of what had just occurred. The dimensional breach collapsed with the finality of a prayer answered by gods who existed in dimensions perpendicular to mortal understanding. But energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Across the galaxy, sensitive psychers reported dreams of two warriors standing back to back against entities that existed in the spaces between thoughts, their weapons raised in defiance of forces that treated linear time as merely another direction in which to hunt. The dreams faded with dawn, but left behind the lingering impression that somewhere in dimensions adjacent to reality, the hunt continued on terms that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. On distant worlds, Orc war bands reported seeing the ghost of a proper good scrap flickering at the edges of their vision during the most intense battles. Space Marine librarians documented visions of an armoured giant standing vigil against creatures that existed in mathematical concepts rather than flesh and blood. Yusha hunting ships detected energy signatures that matched no known weapon emanating from coordinates that led to empty space, where a world had once orbited a dying star. The Inquisition classified the entire incident under Seal Obsidian, restricting access to those with clearance levels that technically did not exist. Tech adepts of the highest orders spent decades analysing fragmentary sensor data, their conclusions carefully encoded in mathematical proofs that could only be understood by minds enhanced beyond baseline human limitations. Their reports spoke of technologies that treated dimensional barriers as merely another form of camouflage and warriors who fought battles that existed in spectrums beyond perception. But in the deepest vaults of the Death Spectre's fortress monastery, a new relic appeared on the day that Xerion Prime vanished from reality. It was a skull unlike any in the chapter's collection, elongated and ridged in ways that spoke of evolution under alien stars. Beside it lay a fragment of biomesh armor, its exotic materials still sparking with energies that made the monastery's machine spirits sing hymns of recognition for technologies that shared common theoretical foundations, despite evolving in isolation across impossible distances. Brother Captain Valerius studied these artifacts with the cold precision of a warrior who had seen enough impossibilities to recognize significance when it manifested. The skull was clearly Xenos in origin, but it had been prepared according to rituals that spoke of honor given to worthy opponents. The armor fragment pulsed with energy signatures that matched theoretical frameworks, describing warriors who hunted across dimensions, seeking prey that could elevate their standing among councils of beings who treated galactic conquest as a recreational activity. Captain said Chaplain Morteus, his enhanced senses detecting residual psychic impressions that clung to the artifacts like morning dew. These items carry echoes of Brother Thaddeus. I sense his presence, though faint and altered by exposure to forces beyond our understanding. Valerius nodded slowly, his understanding shaped by 8 centuries of service to an imperium that existed in a galaxy far stranger than most mortals could comprehend. The evidence suggested that Brother Thaddeus had encountered something beyond standard Xenos classifications, something that required alliance rather than simple extermination. That such alliances could exist spoke of truths that made the universe seem both more hopeful and more terrifying than orthodox doctrine allowed. Place them in the vault of honoured enemies, he commanded. Let them stand as reminder that even in the grim darkness of the far future, honour can transcend the boundaries of species and circumstance. The Emperor's light shines in the strangest places. As the artifacts were sealed away behind wards that would protect them from the corrupting influence of chaos and the ravages of time, psychic resonances continued to echo across the galaxy. On worlds where the veil between dimensions ran thin, warriors reported glimpses of hunters who existed in spectrums beyond perception. Their weapons raised against entities that fed on the fundamental forces holding reality together. The hunt continues in dimensions adjacent to mortal understanding, where predator and prey dance to rhythms that make linear time seem like merely another form of music. And sometimes, in the darkest moments when hope seems lost, and enemies beyond counting press close with hunger that encompasses concepts like causality and existence itself, allies appear from the most unlikely sources to stand vigil against the dying of the light. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But war, like hunting, can sometimes transcend the boundaries that separate species from each other and bind them together against threats that make their ancient enmities seem like lovers' quarrels. The galaxy is vast and full of wonders that make sanity seem like a quaint limitation. In such a place, even the most unlikely alliances can become legends that echo across dimensions where gods hunt in packs, and time itself bleeds at the wounds inflicted by those who dare to challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying reality. Itself, the Emperor protects, and sometimes the protection comes from sources that no human mind could have imagined. Carrying weapons forged in the hearts of dead stars and honor codes that make martyrdom seem like merely another tactical option, in wars that span dimensions and consume universes as collateral damage in conflicts that began before the Mineria. First Star learned to burn and will continue long after the last black hole evaporates into quantum foam and memory.